Americans are not just spenders, they're the biggest consumers on Earth. Right now, private consumption accounts for almost 70% of the US GDP, making consumer spending the dominant engine of the American economy. From oil producers and consumer goods manufacturers to global advertisers, everyone just wants a piece of the American shopper. In the European Union, it's around 52% consumption rate. In China, it's about 39%. No advanced economy relies on consumption as much as the United States does. So the question is not why Americans buy so much, it's why the economy needs them to. This is how consumer spending became America's economic engine. This gap between the US and other countries shows that America built a growth model fundamentally different from its peers. Instead of production, exports, or public investment, America chose consumption as its primary system, and that choice reshaped everything that followed. After World War II ended, the US suddenly had unmatched industrial capacity and millions of returning workers who needed jobs. Instead of dismantling its wartime production system, the government redirected it towards civilian life. Factories retooled to mass-produce household goods, and federal programs like the GI Bill helped families buy homes, attend college, and enter the middle class. New highways connected emerging suburbs to urban centers, amplifying car ownership and retail growth. What followed wasn't just rising prosperity, it was the deliberate construction of a consumer-driven economy designed to keep industry running at full speed. Nowadays, mass-produced consumer items like smartphones, TVs, clothing, and small appliances cost far less, sometimes a fraction of what similar goods did decades ago. For example, flat-screen TVs and electronics have dramatically dropped in cost relative to median income over the past 20 to 30 years. Meanwhile, the things Americans truly need – housing, healthcare, education, childcare – have soared in price. Inflation-adjusted home and rent costs have nearly doubled over recent decades, and medical care and higher education costs have outpaced inflation by a wide margin. What this means in practice, many Americans can more easily afford a new gadget or a streaming subscription than a safe, stable home, decent medical coverage, or higher education. Consumerism has changed. Once signifying luxury, now it shapes the baseline of everyday life. That's not a coincidence. The very structure of a globalized, consumption-first economy made cheap stuff widely available but left essentials lagging behind. The result is a society where non-essentials are affordable, but necessities become increasingly burdensome. As essential costs outpaced earnings, Americans filled the gap with borrowing. According to the New York Federal Reserve, household debt has climbed past $18 trillion, driven by record levels of credit card balances, auto loans, and student debt. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau reports sharp growth in buy now, pay later financing, while subscription-based services now pull fixed payments from millions of households each month. Bureau of Labor Statistics data shows the lowest-income households routinely spend more than their after-tax income, not from reckless choices, but because rent, transportation, and healthcare leave little alternative. Debt has quietly become the mechanism that keeps consumption alive, an economic engine powered by obligations rather than rising wages. Debt influences what Americans buy, and it fundamentally reshapes how people live and work. In a 2024 survey by American Staffing Association, about 40% of U.S. workers said that their debt burden plays a major role in career decisions, forcing many to stay in jobs they dislike, delay quitting, or avoid switching fields. Many workers even take on side jobs or second employment just to stay afloat. Roughly 38% reported doing so because of debt. This is always about desperation rather than ambition. Widespread debt changes incentives. When every paycheck goes toward loan payments, credit cards, student loans, and auto debts, the risk of quitting is no longer leaving a job, but walking into a financial crisis. As a result, worker mobility drops, and people accept longer hours, unpaid overtime, and stagnant wages because stability becomes more valuable than opportunity. In effect, consumer-driven debt doesn't just keep people buying, it keeps them working, often under conditions they would otherwise reject. In a consumption-first economy, insecurity becomes a feature, not a bug. America's economy runs on a simple reality. The rest of the world depends on US shoppers. When households spend, demand flows through retailers, factories, transport networks, and financial markets. This is why downturns in US consumption reliably drag down national growth and often spill into global markets. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, household outlays have become the most sensitive indicator of overall US economic performance, influencing everything from business expansion plans to state revenue forecasts. Foreign manufacturers, tech firms, and luxury brands all shape their strategies around gaining access to American buyers, making US demand a pillar of international trade. This central role also strengthens the dollar, since global firms need it for transactions tied to the American market. But the flip side is clear. When US consumers hesitate, corporate earnings weaken, supply chains stall, and the economic influence the US enjoys can quickly turn into exposure. A deeper issue is that more and more of our consumption now comes from a shrinking group of high-income households. Companies have spent the last decade moving up market because the only people who can reliably afford non-essentials are the wealthy. Pandemic-era data showed the fastest spending growth shifted from low-income earners to high-income households, and businesses followed the money. As a result, an outsized share of profits now depends on the top 10% of consumers, while everyone else is stuck stretching paychecks or taking on debt just to cover basics. At the same time, the number of suppliers has collapsed as industries consolidate. A handful of massive firms dominate entire sectors, which means a small group of companies is increasingly responsible for providing what the wealthiest Americans buy. That combination, fewer buyers with real spending power and fewer companies serving them, makes consumerism harder to unwind, because the entire system is now built around keeping those top spenders happy. So, here's the uncomfortable truth. America didn't just choose consumerism. It built an economy that can't function without it. Growth depends on spending. Spending depends on cheap credit. Cheap credit depends on low interest rates. And low interest rates depend on an economy that never slows down for too long. It's a loop that keeps resetting itself, no matter how many times we question it. And because so much purchasing power is now concentrated at the top, the whole system becomes even more fragile. If wealthy consumers pause for a moment, sales slip. If sales slip, companies cut back. When companies cut back, the economy slows. So we try to kickstart consumption again, usually by making borrowing cheaper or pushing people to spend more. We talk about breaking consumerism like it's a habit Americans can simply quit. But the reality is harder. America's economic stability has been tied to constant buying, and unwinding that without creating chaos would require rethinking everything from wages to corporate incentives to how we measure success. Until then, the engine keeps running because it has to, and we keep buying because the system leaves us no other choice. All right, thank you for listening. Until the next one, peace.